So with this open, I actually can't see the chat. Is that appropriate? Like I won't need to see it?
No, that's fine. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this session of the Slave Dwelling Conference. I'd like to introduce Sarah Harwood for her presentation on He Knew How They Came Here. Sarah, I'm gonna pass it over to you.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I've really enjoyed these presentations and sessions that we've seen so far. So for this, I want to talk about what I've researched with regard to the witch house, how I started doing this research, and what I've learned, where I plan to take it. I feel like the description that I had given when I wrote this proposal was acting like I've got a paper to present, and I think I was just being ambitious. I don't have a paper so much as a PowerPoint and a discussion of some of the things I've learned. So I very, very, very much welcome your questions and your feedback as well, because I would like ultimately to turn this into a paper and publication, but it's pretty bare bones at this point, especially compared to the presentations I've seen from other speakers at the conference so far these last couple of days. I'm just going to grab my phone for the time, because I realize that when I have this up, I don't see what the time is. Okay, so the title, of course, is referring to using archives to learn about enslaved people at the Salem Witch House. So I want to introduce myself first and explain why I'm talking about the Witch House. So I'm Dr. Sarah Harwood, and I'm a professor of English, well, visiting lecturer technically, at Lander University, which is in Greenwood, South Carolina. My background, though, is that I was in Atlanta for 8 years prior to this. So I just moved to South Carolina last month. And if I shift accidentally, you'll see that there's still boxes in the background because I haven't completed unpacking everything yet. Before that, though, practically a past life, I was a tour guide at the Witch House in Salem, and that's what you're seeing up on the screen on the right side. The Witch House is in Salem, Massachusetts, which is just north of Boston. And I've had that job as tour guide as my summer job when I was in college. So now I'm dating myself, but the years that I was there when I was doing this research were 2004 to 2008. And after that, long story, but I ended up leaving the Witch House and went to graduate school for my master's degree. And I wrote my master's thesis on the Witch House, but not on the 17th century part that we'll talk about today, but rather on the 19th century, the time that the Corwin Mansion, as it had been called, became known as the Witch House, and why it became known as the Witch House, how that affiliation became everything about its identity. So that's what my master's thesis was on. So the research that we're presenting today stems from before that, from when I was a tour guide. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the screen progressing now, and you'll see the Witch House, Salem, Mass. So just a little bit about the house itself. I'm going to go into tour guide mode. It's been like over a decade, and yet it's just so natural. So the house, despite what you might read online, was not built in 1642, was likely first built in 1675 for a man named Nathaniel Davenport. And it was purchased by Jonathan Corwin, who ultimately became a judge in the Salem witchcraft trials. Here you see the deed, well, one of the pages of the deed on the left. He bought it when he was in his mid-30s. He was living in Boston at the time. He was the son of a very prominent merchant named George Corwin, and he bought this house. Seems that it was incomplete. He had it completed. Now, I just want to be really clear in terms of who completed it. He hired a master carpenter, and the work would have been done by free people, carpenters. So it was not built by slave labor. I just want to be clear about that, especially because now I've been in the South so long, I think we assume buildings were completed by enslaved labor, but that's not the case with this building. There was an enslaved person at the house, as we'll talk about, but the home itself was not built or completed by enslaved people. So far as I know anyway, they weren't involved in it. Okay. So completed about 1679, that's when he moved in. He was living there when he was a judge during the Salem witchcraft trials, sent 19 people to execution in 1692 during the witch trials. Lived his life, had kids, all of that, died. And then the property was divvied up among his descendants. Now, none of his children outlived him, so it went to his grandchildren. So that's when the property really started to be divided up, and that is why none of the outbuildings have survived. So all we have is the original house right here in the middle. And this is the oldest known photo of the house. It had already been changed by this point. It had a gabled roof like you saw on the last slide, but it ended up getting a gambrel roof, which was more the style of the mid 1700s. So we've got the gambrel roof, but this is the oldest photo. So it changed quite a bit over the years. Ultimately, in the 19th century, had a store attached, and that store operated. That's around the time it started to be known as the Witch House, because there was a store, so marketing. Salem also became famous for the role in the witch trials. You know, it became a tourist destination in the 19th century. And then this became known as the Witch House. And then finally, in the 1940s, there was a street widening project. My theory is the project actually happened because the city had their eyes on the house. It was already a moneymaker, but for the private owners of the home. So the city decided to widen the street. You can see it here on the map, that they decided to widen this street and had to reroute traffic right by the witch house, and they would have to demolish the witch house in order to widen the street to reroute traffic. So the city decided they were going to seize it by eminent domain, restore it, and make it a museum. So they did, and it opened as a museum in the 1940s. The location within Salem is right here. Now, Jonathan Corwin's property originally went all the way back to the water, so it was several acres, but now it's pretty much just the house. Don't have a portrait of Jonathan Corwin himself, so I have the next closest thing, his dad and his son. This is the restored house as it looks today. This is obviously a slightly older photo, but the house hasn't changed in appearance. As for the Corwin family, so talk about how Jonathan Corwin was an enslaver. So I'm calling him Corwin and Corwin because it was actually pronounced Corwin, but he spelled it Corwin, and so that pronunciation is just taken on, so everyone just calls him Jonathan Corwin, but he would have called himself Jonathan Corwin. But the Corwin family, while we'll talk about how Jonathan Corwin was an enslaver, so far as I've been able to find, there was only one enslaved person in the house at any time that any Corwin owned the house. But Corwin also made his money from slavery, like a northern merchant of the time. So he basically took on the same business that his father had. As you can tell from the picture, the lace kerchief and everything, that George Corwin, first of all, doesn't look like the cheeriest guy, but also extremely wealthy. And that wealth came from being engaged in the triangle trade, timber and fish from the north, going down to the West Indies, where it was traded for rum and sugar, and sometimes trading across the ocean too, but mostly doing a trade back and forth with the West Indies. So, rum, sugar, tobacco, all of that was coming from enslaved labor. He did not, Jonathan Corwin. I'm not entirely sure about George, but I don't think George either, that either of them were involved in actual slave trade, but the trade that they did came from enslaved people. The other person, the person on the right, is Jonathan Corwin's son, George, who went to Harvard, became a minister. He died shortly before Jonathan Corwin did. So that's why I said there were only grandchildren that survived Jonathan. And just some pictures to show you how the house is interpreted today. So these are, I know, a little bit fuzzy, but it's a historic house museum. And technically it focuses on showing the life of people in Salem at the time of the Salem witchcraft trials. Now, as I said, it was made to a museum in 1945, so it's one of the older ones. And in Salem, it's one of the only ones that really does focus on 17th century lifestyle. While these photos are a little bit old, the interpretation hasn't changed. So it does not focus on telling the story of the witch trials. You can learn that anywhere else. I'd be interested to hear in the chat who has been to Salem before and who has been to the witch house versus who has been to the other sites. What I have found in Salem, both from doing research on Salem and from having lived there and been a tour guide, is that a lot of tourists seem to expect like a northern New Orleans, that they expect it to be kind of like, I'm gonna use jazz hands, like spooky and witchy and fun and entertainment. That's what they're expecting when they go to Salem. Like it's just gonna be like maybe a cheaper and closer version of New Orleans. And it's not. And yeah, it's tacky. Let's put it that way. There are a lot of sites in Salem that are super tacky, but the thing about Salem compared to New Orleans or any other place is that in Salem, the tourism is related to the Salem witchcraft trials. There were Wiccans who came in the 1960s, 1970s and have established like, you know, a setting there, but like the fame of Salem going right back to the 1800s and the tourism began. It's about the witch trials, which was about the deaths of innocent people. So there's thanatourism, as it's called, involved in Salem, and therefore tend to get a mix of people who want to be educated, want to learn about things, learn about what life was like, and also learn about the true tragedy of the Salem witchcraft trials. There are those people, but then there are also a lot of folks who just want entertainment, just want fun. And so the witch house, being owned by the city now and encouraged to make a lot of money to help pay for other projects for the city, has to kind of walk the line between both. So it's trying to provide education. It's also trying to provide entertainment and fun. I feel like you don't get a whole lot of fun and entertainment from these pictures. And certainly I would hear a lot of tourists say things like, it's just an old house. It's just a bunch of furniture, which is true. It is just an old house with a bunch of furniture. I think though, this is where I'm getting kind of to the point, is that because there is this pressure to be entertaining and to be somewhat fun, the city and management have backed down a bit from trying to really tell a story about the people who actually live there. They want to tell about 17th century life, but it's a pretty narrow view of 17th century life. Flash forward just so you can see a couple more pictures where we have the hearth, which is representing like cooking that would have been done in theory by Mrs. Corwin. And then, you know, the dining room table set with the expensive metals that would have been imported to show off sort of a high-end lifestyle that was lived in this house. So it's not really an accurate depiction, even if you're just focusing on white people, and just focusing on white people, as I've implied, is misleading as well. But they have sort of combined colonial revival, rustic type of lifestyle with the actual luxurious lifestyle that the Corwin family had. George Corwin, the dad, was much wealthier than Jonathan Corwin, but Jonathan was still extremely wealthy. He would be a millionaire, you know, by today's standards. So he was living compared to other people in 17th century Salem, a very upscale type of life, and had a very nice house by the standards of that day, which of course then does raise the question that sometimes tourists would ask, but mostly they didn't, which is, was he an enslaver? So I started doing research on the house just because I wanted to learn more about Corwin, what his life was like, what the house was like, the accuracy of the furnishing, what we could do with that. I just started to do research on that. And so I started to look through court records, anything I could find about Jonathan Corwin. I went through city records from back when Salem would have like regular town meetings, court records. Jonathan Corwin went to court a lot. I also ended up going through his personal archives, and no one had done this before. Even though the home had been around for so long, the museum had been established for so long, I guess no one had bothered to do that research before. So it uncovered some things. So the first thing I uncovered was the Gibbs family, and this is where the enslaved person, Sancho, comes in. So the Gibbs family was tied to the Corwin family because Jonathan Corwin, when he bought the house in 1675, also married a woman named Elizabeth Gibbs. And we, for some reason, didn't realize that Elizabeth Gibbs was actually a widow, the widow of Robert Gibbs. And Robert Gibbs is the person who was an enslaver. And Robert and Elizabeth had 4 children. 2 survived to adulthood, 3 survived to the point of having their portrait done. It was Margaret who passed away not long after this portrait was done. So there were these 2 children that came with the marriage and came to the house. So that was the first thing that was kind of surprising is, oh, and it's kind of like, well, duh, but yeah, Elizabeth had a life before Jonathan. And that means that changed our interpretation in terms of the rich white children that were living in the house. But then that also led to thinking about who the Gibbses were, what they did, how they had any kind of impact on Jonathan Corwin's life and what it looks like. And you can kind of tell from these portraits, like these are even more upscale than the George Corwin portrait that you just saw a few minutes ago. Like this is the height of wealth. So Robert Gibbs was a merchant who was living in Boston and had a mansion in what is now the financial district. The mansion is long gone. He had a wharf, though, warehouses. He was extremely wealthy. He was involved in the triangle trade, too, just like Jonathan, just like George. So he passed away. Elizabeth Gibbs was then left with this huge inheritance from him, and she married Jonathan Corwin, and Jonathan Corwin took all that, invested part of it in the Witch House or the Corwin Mansion, and also took over the business. And so as I was going through court records trying to learn more, that is when I came across Sancho, who was an enslaved person who came to the Witch House from Robert Gibbs. Now, unfortunately, there are no or very, very few records surviving from Robert Gibbs. While there are a lot of records surviving from Jonathan Corwin, Gibbs family didn't leave very much. So I have not been able to find out how Sancho came to Robert Gibbs, how old Sancho was, for example, when he joined the Corwin household. There are still a lot of questions, unfortunately, there. And if you have any leads on how you think I would be able to answer those questions, I would be delighted to hear them. But at any rate, we came from Robert Gibbs. Given that Gibbs was involved in trade with the West Indies, given that Sancho has a Spanish name, Sancho, it seems very likely that he came from the West Indies, that Robert Gibbs, my understanding, and again, the records are incomplete. My understanding is Robert Gibbs also was not directly involved in slave trade, but profited from it through trading rum and sugar and tobacco. But it seems likely that he purchased Sancho from a West Indian plantation. But again, that's speculation just based on Robert Gibbs' trade and Sancho's name, because there were not many enslaved people named Sancho in Massachusetts at this time. That's a pretty distinctly Spanish-sounding name. So distinctly Spanish-sounding that the town records got it wrong. And so I first heard of him through the town records, actually through this particular court case. Let me check on the time. Okay. Good. So this particular court case, this is where we can learn a bit about Sancho. There's not very much, unfortunately, that I've been able to uncover about him. His existence was one thing that was already really enlightening in terms of being able to change the interpretation of the house, change the narrative about the house, but also in terms of his life. So here's the proof that he came through Robert Gibbs. So there was an agreement that was made between Elizabeth Gibbs and John Wing of Boston. And this is something that enslavers did over the years, I think in the South as well as in the North. So the enslavers, would own an enslaved person, and rather than have the enslaved person work for them in their house, on their property, whatever, they would rent that enslaved person out and charge a fee for the work of the enslaved person. And then, of course, the enslaver would keep that money. So that's what Elizabeth Gibbs chose to do shortly after she was widowed, and just before she married Jonathan Corwin, or possibly right after, since they were married in 75. I'm not sure why she has her maiden or her married name on this agreement, but she contracted with John Wing that Sancho would go to John Wing's house and be John Wing's slave for 4 years. And John Wing would pay Elizabeth Gibbs 22 pounds total, which comes out to 5.5 pounds per year for Sancho's labor. This is the first time that I heard about it, was this court case. This court case, I've just got one little clip of it, but the court case does tell us a little bit more. The reason it ended up going to court is that John Wing didn't pay Elizabeth Gibbs. Now, by this time, Corwin was married to Elizabeth Gibbs, so he was managing the estate. So he was the one who actually went to court about it on behalf of his wife, and he pointed out that he was only paid about half the money that John Wing refused to pay. And what John Wing argued was that John Wing, had already spent the amount of money on Sancho. He had already put that money towards it, and therefore didn't think he needed to give that money to Jonathan Corwin. And this tells us a little bit about, only a little bit, but a little bit about what Sancho went through. What John Wing describes in the court record is that Sancho was extremely sick. So he mentions that in 1678, there was a smallpox epidemic. Sancho caught smallpox, and he ended up going to live with a nurse and getting a medication that John Wing was paying for, and was nursed until he was more or less recovered from smallpox. However, then he went back to the nurse a couple months later because he had French pox, which is syphilis. Don't know how he got it, but the nurse ended up, trying to treat him, but she decided that she was not able to treat him for it, that he needed a doctor. So they sent for a doctor, and the doctor supposedly cured him of the French pox, which I don't believe was possible at that time. I don't think there was a cure for syphilis in the 17th century, but I'm not a medical historian. But anyway, so he supposedly treated him, cured him for French pox, sent him back to John Wing. And now John Wing said there are all these medical bills, and therefore he doesn't think he needs to pay the remaining amount. The testimony also indicated that Sancho had been ill for quite some time, that for many days at a time, right from the time that he joined the Wing household, he was unable to work. Now, whether this is because he had syphilis all this time, and it was just getting progressively worse, or whether this was resistance on Sancho's part, we don't know, but it does give us some insight into Sancho's life and exactly how deeply he suffered over those years. The court ultimately, by the way, did end up agreeing with Jonathan Corwin, and Wing had to pay him the remaining 10-ish pounds that were owed supposedly to him. So again, all of that labor that Sancho did while ill with syphilis and with smallpox, that money all went to Jonathan Corwin. At the end of this contract in 1680, Sancho rejoined the Corwin household. By this time, Corwin had moved to Salem, so Sancho would have gone to the witch house. The other court case where Sancho shows up is really weird, kind of convoluted court case, but one that involved a robbery. Long story, but a man stole some pewter plates out of the warehouse of another man. And so he stole the pewter plates. A neighbor saw the plates and tried to take them and gave them to the man's wife. Her name was Mrs. Beasley. So I guess she gave them to Mrs. Beasley, and Mrs. Beasley was going to return them, but decided to keep a couple of them. For whatever reason, in the court record, she testifies that the two she decided to keep, these pewter plates, she gave to Sancho to hide in the barn at the Corwin mansion. And then Jonathan Corwin found them, and Sancho, as the court record says, would not own that he knew how they came there. That's where we get the title for the presentation today. I find this to be an interesting insight into resistance on Sancho's part. It doesn't seem from the court records that Sancho was involved in the robbery other than in trying to cover it up. But it seems that, when this happened, he wasn't going to play along with Jonathan Corwin or with anybody else that represented the law in that case, which is pretty courageous when you think about just how little representation he had in that kind of situation. When I read this court record, I wondered if we would hear anything else from Sancho again after that, because that's Corwin. Already know he was a judge in the witchcraft trials. He was a tough person, very likely not gracious to anybody, let alone an enslaved person. He uses pretty tough language, let's say, in the court case from 1680. So the consequences for Sancho, I wondered about them. And unfortunately, in court records, Sancho does not appear again. He does appear again, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but not in any of the court records. This picture is just showing what a barn would have looked like. Corwin's estate, while now it's just a house, was actually orchards, apple orchards behind the house going back to the river. So there was a barn, there would have been outhouses, animals. And this indicates too, since Sancho was hiding them in the barn, that Sancho likely lived in a barn that looked like this. There were not slave quarters. And so far as I know, Sancho was the only enslaved person that the Corwin family ever owned. So there wouldn't have been quarters or any kind of separate building, but very likely because he was having that access to the barn and hiding things there, that's where he would have been living, at least during the warmer months. So this is the area. This is a Sandmore map from the 20th century. So this whole area originally would have been Corwin's lot when Sancho was not being hired out to other people for his labor. He would have been likely working on the apple orchard, picking apples, preparing cider, and of course, looking after the house as a domestic servant. The Corwin family did have indentured servants in the household as well. So they would have done the majority of the work in the house, such as the cooking, cleaning, running the household. That would have been done by free indentured servants, not enslaved people. But Sancho likely would have done work on the outside of the house. And this is just an image of the back of the house from the 19th century, kind of showing somewhat what it would have looked like. It looks nothing like that right now. So this is a little bit more historically accurate than showing you a modern picture of the back of the house. Only this extension wouldn't have been there in the 17th century. Okay, so this is a picture of the attic, which is likely what would have been Sancho's living space during the winter months. As you can see, well, you can't see the whole chimney, but there was never a fireplace up in the attic. So the attic was not heated. It would have been extremely cold. Massachusetts can get down to 10, 20 degrees overnight in the winter. This is, of course, our HVAC system that was installed in the 20th century. But other than that, the roof hasn't changed because the roof line was restored when the house was restored. This gives you a sense of what the attic was like. Not a cozy place, extremely cold and drafty in the winter, with no source of heat. And then in the summer, it gets extremely hot. It gets to be about 90 degrees. In the summer, he likely would have been sleeping out in the barn. This is what would be typical for enslaved people in the North. There usually would not be separate slave quarters for them. They would be in the house, in the garret, or they would be in the barn, depending on the season. But I just wanted to show you this inside space that obviously is not interpreted now. It's not interpreted and the HVAC system was put there because it's not a pleasant space, but also now it can't be interpreted because the HVAC system has actually damaged the floor so badly that it's no longer safe for people to go up there. Even staff aren't allowed to walk around up there. But this choice about interpreting the property deliberately left out this space. Now, even when the house was restored, people knew, they didn't know that there was an enslaved person. We didn't know that until I came across these court records, but they knew that this space would have been used by at least indentured servants, if not an enslaved person. So they knew that this was a living space as well as a storage space, but they deliberately chose to keep that out of the cozier picture that they present in the bottom floors that you've already seen. Now there's no chance of being able to interpret this space, but you could still interpret Sancho's life in the bottom floors. For just a couple of months in 2010, they did that. They put together an exhibit. It was run by a grad student from UMass, I believe. He was a master's student. He put together temporary exhibit on Sancho. Unfortunately, he called him Zanky and just talked about the one court record with the theft and didn't comment on how that would have impacted Sancho's life or the idea of resistance. He didn't comment on that. It was just more like, hey, did you know there was an enslaved person in this house? That's more like what the exhibit was meant to do. And then the exhibit was taken down and Sancho is not, so far as I know, mentioned anymore. Now interpretation focuses more so on the witch trials. This is a screen print of the history section of the Witch House website. And as you can see, so this is George, this is not Jonathan. But again, we don't have a portrait of Jonathan, but it's focusing on the wealth of Corwin and the fact that he was part of the witch trials. That's focus of their interpretation, what life was like in the 17th century during the witch trials, but life of the Corwin family, particularly Jonathan Corwin, not the life of the enslaved person who was living in the house. So the reason, or the way I found out that his name actually was Sancho, was from Jonathan Corwin's papers, his day books. He kept meticulous records of his business, and his records indicate the day-to-day expenses, day-to-day sales that he did as a merchant. And in those records, it's clear that after the court case with John Wing, that he continued to send out Sancho, but he only sent Sancho out for a couple of days at a time. So it seems that from 1680 onwards until Sancho passed away, that Sancho was living, as I showed you, in that attic or in the barn, and then would go to other people in Salem just for a day at a time to do manual labor for them, again, for a fee that then was paid to Jonathan Corwin. The last record of Sancho performing any of this work, so the last time he appears in Jonathan Corwin's account books, is in the late 1680s. So the assumption is that he passed away shortly after that, which makes sense. If he had syphilis, that likely he was continuing to decline over those years until he probably passed away from syphilis. So we can learn more about him from those people that he was working for, from learning a little bit more about the doctor that treated him, about John Wing, about the nurse that looked after him when he had smallpox. So we can learn a little bit more. Unfortunately, I hit a bit of a dead end because of Robert Gibbs. Without those records, it's kind of hard to find where Sancho came from, how he got to Massachusetts to begin with, other than with speculation. So that wraps up my presentation. This is my contact information. It's G Harwood because my first name is Grace, but I go by my middle name, Sarah. So G Harwood at lander.edu. And this is just a little plaque saying the house was built in 1642, which it was not. It was built in 1675. And then this is what the house looks like today. So I think we've got a few minutes for me to take questions. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes. I would love to hear any questions anyone has. Let's see if I can.
Hi, Sarah.
Yes.
It's Teresa popping in. I don't think you got my chat. Unfortunately, your slides didn't advance. And so you weren't in presentation mode. So if there was a way that we'll figure out a way to get your PowerPoint, if that's okay with you, available to the folks that watched your presentation. I do want to let you know that Leslie popped in and said they really enjoyed your presentation. But she said it's so good to remind Northerners that they enslaved people as well. And those spaces really do need to be interpreted. Stacy Cole said, Sarah, thank you for doing your talk. It's wonderful information. But I don't see any questions, but we are open for questions if anybody has any. I'm not seeing anything. Oh, there we go. Are you seeing the chat as well, Sarah?
I am, yeah. So I've gone out of the presentation mode. That's so weird that it didn't.
I know, it's so weird. And I tried everything I could on my end. But do you see the question that Adrienne asked?
Yes. No, not that I'm aware. The National Park Service site has started to study enslaved people, but not really from the 17th century. The 18th century is more of the focus. And so I know that the Park Service has been talking about slavery at the Derby House and started to include that like on their social media posts, for example. But in terms of, well, there's that. So when it comes to like enslaved people in Salem in general, yeah, the Derby House and National Park Service. That's what I think of off the top of my head. However, then there's a whole other thing that I didn't even touch on, which is the witch trials themselves and Tituba. So Tituba was an enslaved person who was enslaved by Samuel Parris. And it was in Samuel Parris, the minister's household, where the witch trials really began. Tituba, she was from the West Indies. They call her the Indian woman, and he had just come from the West Indies when he moved to Salem. So know her background a little bit more, but she was actually the first person accused of witchcraft during the Salem witchcraft trials. And it's a whole can of worms to talk about her because the interpretation of her and her role in the witchcraft trials, the way people write about it reflects on them, let's say. Some people talk about her as a victim. Paris, for example, it's now known that he whipped her until she confessed and started naming other witches, and that's what got the ball rolling in terms of the witchcraft trials. There had been previous cases of witchcraft before, and there'd been 1-2 witches accused who would confess or be convicted. They'd be executed. That was the end of the whole thing. Still tragic, obviously, but stopping at 1 or 2. That happened many times before in Massachusetts and other colonies. What was different with Salem is Tituba said, yes, I'm a witch, and those 2 other women are as well. And I know there are other people because I saw the devil gave me a list and I saw other names, and that led to more accusations. So some historians will say Tituba is the one who started it because she name the names. But at the same time, she was an enslaved woman. And again, whole can of worms opened with that, because in confessing, in naming names, she then became a star witness during the witchcraft trial. So she was given agency and a voice that an enslaved woman, a woman, or an enslaved person would not have otherwise. And some historians have said this shows you exactly what was wrong with the witch trials, that the wrong people were given power, the wrong people were given control in the court. The interpretation of the witch trials is so fascinating because people will put so many different spins on it. So in terms of, yes, study of slavery, not so much slavery per se, but Tituba, has been studied, mentioned, discussed a lot in the context of the Salem witchcraft trials.
And Eileen dropped some links in for that National Park Service digital program. Do we have any other questions? No, everybody's just saying thanks. So we will go ahead and end this session. Thank you so much for joining us at this session of the Slave Dwelling Project Conference 2021.
Thank you.